Charlotte Dugan had everything a woman of 1878 Boston was supposed to want, and the morning she walked away from all of it was the morning she finally felt like herself. The Dugan family home sat at the corner of Beacon and Charles like a monument to accumulated wealth, 5 stories of red brick and iron railings, servants moving through its corridors like ghosts, the smell of beeswax, and rose water so constant it had become the smell of suffocation to Charlotte. Her father, Edmund Dugan, had made his fortune in textile mills, and her mother, Vivienne, had made her life's work the careful navigation of Boston society. Charlotte was their eldest daughter, 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair and gray eyes that people often called striking, but which Charlotte thought looked simply like the color of a sky that could not decide what it wanted to be. She had been engaged twice. The first time to a banker named Gerald Forsyth, who had soft hands and a soft laugh, and whose idea of passion was debating tariff reform over supper. The second time to a shipping merchant named Thomas Calloway, who was handsome enough but who looked at Charlotte the way he looked at his ledger books, as something to be tallied and balanced and kept in order. Both engagements had ended with Charlotte returning the ring and enduring weeks of her mother's tearful disappointment. Both times she had felt not regret, but a strange flooding relief, like a window thrown open in a stuffy room. What Charlotte wanted, what she had wanted since she was a girl pressing her nose to the illustrated pages of Harper's Weekly and reading every account she could find of life beyond the Mississippi, was the West. Not the romantic myth of it exactly, though she would not deny there was poetry in the thought of wide open country and sky that went on forever. What she wanted was something real, land, work that meant something. A life where the choices she made mattered in a direct and physical way, where the ground beneath her feet was honest about what it was. She had read every account she could find. Horace Greeley's exhortations, letters from homesteaders published in Eastern papers, accounts of Kansas and Colorado and the territories beyond. She had studied maps in the reading room of the Boston Athenaeum, tracing rivers and mountain ranges with her finger, until the librarian grew uncomfortable with the intensity of her attention. She had saved money quietly, carefully, over 2 years, taking a small percentage of her quarterly allowance and setting it aside in a cigar box hidden beneath the floorboards of her wardrobe. The fight with her father came in the spring of 1878, when Edmund announced at dinner that he had arranged for Charlotte to meet a widower named Hargrove, a man of 52 who owned half of Gloucester and who needed, in Edmund's words, a sensible woman to manage his household and his 3 children. Charlotte set her fork down with a gentleness that her mother recognized immediately as dangerous. "No," Charlotte said. The word hung in the candle-lit dining room like a stone thrown into still water. Edmund looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who believed he had misheard. Vivienne pressed her napkin to her lips. "Charlotte," her father said, his voice carrying that particular warning weight that had, for most of her life, been enough to close the subject. "I will not meet Mr. Hargrove," Charlotte said. "I will not meet any man you have selected for me. I am going west, father. I have been planning it for 2 years, and I am going." What followed was not a single explosive argument, but 3 days of increasingly exhausting confrontation. Her mother wept. Her father threatened to cut off her allowance, which Charlotte absorbed calmly because she had already planned for it. Her younger sister Margaret looked at her with an admiration she did not quite dare to express aloud. Friends of the family called to speak sense to her. The family solicitor was summoned, as though the law might prevent a woman from boarding a train. None of it changed anything. On a Tuesday morning in late April, with the chestnut trees along the street just coming into pale green bud, Charlotte Dugan carried 2 carpet bags and a small trunk to the street, hired a cab to South Station, and bought a ticket for the Transcontinental Railroad. She had $260 in cash, a good wool coat, and a letter of introduction to a woman named Mrs. Adeline Ferris, who ran a boarding house in a small cattle town in Colorado called Harlan's Creek. She had found Mrs. Ferris through an advertisement in a women's newspaper that occasionally ran pieces about homesteading life, an advertisement that promised respectable accommodation and assistance for women of good character seeking honest employment in the Western Territories. Charlotte had written to Mrs. Ferris 3 months before and received back a reply that was blunt and practical and completely free of the sort of sentimental encouragement Charlotte had feared. Mrs. Ferris needed a woman who could teach, as the town had no schoolteacher and more than a dozen children who needed educating. The pay would be modest, the conditions rough. Mrs. Ferris would help her get settled, but she would not coddle her. Charlotte had written back immediately to say she would take it. The journey west by rail in 1878 was not a gentle undertaking. Charlotte crossed from Boston to Chicago on the lake shore and Michigan Southern Line, sitting in a second-class car that smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, the landscape outside changing from the tightly ordered fields of New England to the broad, flat expanse of the Midwest, with a gradual drama that she found more moving than she had expected. In Chicago, she transferred to a westbound train that would take her to Kansas, where she would board a stagecoach for the last leg of the journey into Colorado. She was not afraid. She noticed this with some surprise, sitting in the rocking train car watching the Great Plains open up outside the window, that flat golden immensity broken only by the dark lines of distant tree lines and the occasional farmstead standing alone in the grass like a thought someone had forgotten to complete. She was not afraid. She was awake in a way she had never been in her father's dining room, or in the drawing rooms of Boston society, or in any of the spaces she had been told were the correct places for a woman like her to inhabit. The stagecoach ride from the Kansas railhead to Harlan's Creek took 2 days. Charlotte shared the coach with a traveling dry goods salesman named Mr. Phelps, who talked without stopping for the first several hours until he fell asleep and began snoring with his hat over his face. A young married couple named the Brewsters, who were going to homestead on land in eastern Colorado, and who held hands with the constant tight grip of people who knew exactly how much they were betting on each other, and an older man who said nothing at all, but who looked out the window with the expression of someone coming home. Harlan's Creek appeared first as a smear of brown and gray against the wide Colorado sky, buildings the same color as the earth they sat on, a main street of packed dirt with wooden boardwalks, cottonwood trees along the creek line glittering silver in the afternoon light. The stagecoach rolled in with its usual cloud of dust, and Charlotte stepped down onto the street, her back aching and her hair coming loose from its pins, and she stood there for a moment just looking. It was nothing like Boston. It was nothing like anything she had known. The street smelled of horses and dust and wood smoke. A dog was sleeping in the middle of the road. 2 men leaned against the post outside the saloon watching the stagecoach arrive with the idle curiosity of people who did not have a great deal to do on a Tuesday afternoon. A woman in a faded calico dress was sweeping her front porch with the methodical dedication of someone who knew the dust would simply come back and swept anyway because the sweeping was the point. Charlotte loved it immediately and completely. Mrs. Adeline Ferris was waiting for her. She was a woman of about 50, solid and compact, with iron-gray hair and brown eyes that assessed people quickly and accurately, and without any particular sentimentality about the results. She took one look at Charlotte, at her good clothes and her careful posture and her expensive carpet bags, and said, "You will need different shoes." "I was told as much," Charlotte said. Mrs. Ferris almost smiled. "Come on then." The boarding house was on the east end of the main street, a 2-story clapboard building that was clean and practical and entirely comfortable if you were not expecting anything beyond clean and practical. Charlotte was given a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the creek, a bed with a good mattress, a washstand, and a small wood stove. She stood at the window in the late afternoon light and watched the cottonwoods move in the wind and felt, for the first time in her memory, completely in the right place. She started teaching 3 days after arriving. The school was a single-room building at the edge of town, a little battered but solidly built, with 16 children ranging in age from 6 to 14 who looked at her with varying degrees of suspicion, curiosity, and the resigned wariness of children who had seen teachers come and go. Charlotte had taught Sunday school in Boston and had the advantage of genuine enthusiasm for books and ideas, which children tend to recognize as more reliable than performed authority. By the end of the second week, she had established something approaching order, and by the end of the month she had their genuine attention. She found the work consuming and satisfying in a way that nothing in her previous life had been. She also found that the town of Harlan's Creek, small as it was, had its own complex social geography. There was the merchant class, such as it was, the owner of the general store, the man who ran the mill, the doctor, the land office clerk, people who were comfortable and settled, and who looked at the surrounding country with the satisfaction of those who had made their claim and were holding it. There was the saloon and its attendant population of drifters, drovers, and men who had come west for reasons they did not discuss. There were the homesteaders scattered across the surrounding land, a hardworking and largely exhausted population of people trying to build something permanent out of soil and determination. And there were the ranchers, some large operations with significant land and hired hands, some small independent outfits running cattle on ground that was never quite good enough, and whether that was never quite predictable enough. It was in this last category that Aaron Weston existed, and it was 6 weeks after her arrival that Charlotte first heard his name. She heard it from Mrs. Ferris, who mentioned him in passing while they were eating supper together one evening. A student of Charlotte's, a girl named Lily Weston, had been absent for 3 days, and Charlotte had asked after her. "She's Aaron Weston's sister," Mrs. Ferris said. "He's been fighting to keep her in school since their parents passed 2 years ago. When the ranch has trouble, she has to stay home and help. He runs the smallest outfit in the county. About 800 acres, barely that, and he works it alone except when he can afford to hire on a seasonal hand, which isn't often. Good man, proud, doesn't take help easily." "What happened to his parents?" Charlotte asked. "Fever. Took them both within a week of each other in the winter of '76. Aaron was 23, Lily was 12. He's been raising her and keeping the ranch going ever since." Charlotte absorbed this. "She's a bright girl," she said. "One of the best readers I have." "Tell him that," Mrs. Ferris said. "He'll appreciate knowing it." Charlotte rode out to the Weston ranch the following Saturday morning, borrowing a gentle mare from the livery and following the directions Mrs. Ferris had given her. The road took her south out of town along the creek, then west across a stretch of open grassland broken by low red rock outcroppings, and then up a long gradual rise to a valley that held the ranch in a shallow cup of land, sheltered on the north side by a ridge of cottonwood and pine. It was not much to look at from a distance. The main house was a low adobe and timber structure, well maintained but spare. There was a barn weathered to gray, a corral with 4 horses, a chicken house, and a kitchen garden that showed signs of careful attention. A creek ran along the western edge of the property, lined with willows. She saw him before she reached the yard. He was working at the corral fence, replacing a section of railing, his back to her. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas coat and a battered hat. He moved with the particular economy of someone who was used to working hard and knowing exactly what each motion was for. He heard her horse and turned, and Charlotte saw his face for the first time. He was not what she might have imagined from Mrs. Ferris's description of a dirt-poor struggling rancher. He was young, 25 or so, with dark eyes and a jaw that carried 2 days of dark stubble, a face that was weathered in the way of someone who spent all his time outdoors, with a kind of directness in his expression that she found immediately arresting. Not handsome in the soft, careful way of the men she had known in Boston. Handsome in a way that seemed to come from something harder and more fundamental, the way a good tool is handsome because it is exactly what it needs to be. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read, neutral and steady, the kind of look that neither welcomed nor dismissed. "Mr. Weston," Charlotte said, stopping her horse. "That's right." His voice was low and even. "You'd be Miss Dugan. Lily mentioned a new school teacher. I came to check on her. She's been absent 3 days." Something shifted in his expression, not exactly softening but a kind of acknowledgement. He set down the fence rail he had been holding. "She's not sick," he said. "Had a problem with some of the cattle and needed her help moving them. My fault. Won't happen again this week." "I'm not here to scold you, Mr. Weston," Charlotte said. "I'm here because she's one of my best students and I wanted to make sure she was well, and to bring her these." She reached into the bag hanging from her saddle horn and produced 3 books, "so she doesn't fall behind." He looked at the books, then back at her, and for just a moment she saw something complicated pass across his face. Gratitude and something else that might have been pride reluctantly set aside. "She'll be glad of those," he said. He moved toward her horse and she handed the books down to him. His hand was calloused and sure. "She has a real gift for reading," Charlotte said. "I'd hate to see it go to waste." "It won't," he said, with a quiet certainty that told her the subject was important to him. "Her education is the one thing I won't let slide." Charlotte looked at him a moment longer than was strictly required, then gathered her reins. "Good day, Mr. Weston. Miss Dugan." He touched the brim of his hat. She rode back toward town with the strange awareness that she was thinking about his eyes. Lily came back to school on Monday, bringing the books back with careful notes penciled in the margins in her small, neat handwriting. She was a serious girl, 12 years old, with her brother's dark eyes, and a quality of watchfulness that Charlotte recognized as the quality of children who have had to grow up faster than is comfortable. She was also, as Charlotte had told Aaron, genuinely gifted. Over the following weeks, Charlotte found reasons to ride out to the Weston ranch more than strictly necessary. She told herself it was because of Lily, and this was not entirely untrue. But she was also honest enough with herself, in the quiet of her room with the creak sounds coming through the window at night, to acknowledge that Aaron Weston occupied an unusual amount of her thinking for a man she had met once. He was there when she visited, most of the time. He did not seem to seek her out, but neither did he disappear. He worked while she sat with Lily at the kitchen table, the sounds of him outside, the ring of a hammer, the creak of a gate, the occasional low word to one of his horses, forming a kind of background to her visits that she noticed the absence of when it wasn't there. Once she arrived to find Lily had ridden into town without telling him, and Aaron came in from the south pasture to find Charlotte sitting alone on the porch steps with a book, and they looked at each other in that sudden, unprotected way of people who have not had time to compose themselves. "She's in town," Charlotte said. "I know. I just came from that direction." He took off his hat and ran his hand through his hair, which was dark and slightly too long and damp at the temples from work. "Sorry you had a wasted trip." "It wasn't wasted," Charlotte said, which was true. The ride had been beautiful, the afternoon light making the grass look like hammered gold. But she felt the color rising slightly in her face, and was glad she had been out in the sun enough recently that it was harder to notice. He sat down on the step below her, at a careful distance, and they stayed like that for a while in a silence that was comfortable in the way silence between people is only comfortable when they have something real between them, even if neither of them has named it yet. "Mrs. Ferris tells me you came from Boston," he said eventually. "I did." "Long way to come to teach school in a one-room building." "I know," Charlotte said. "It was exactly the right distance." He looked at her sideways at that with a quality of attention that made her feel seen in a way she was not entirely accustomed to. "You miss it?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I miss my sister. I miss certain books I had to leave behind. I miss a particular maple tree in the garden." She paused. "I don't miss anything else." He nodded slowly as though this made sense to him. "I've never been further east than Denver," he said. "Can't imagine what Boston looks like." "Big," she said. "And very certain of itself. The way places are when they've been there long enough to stop questioning whether they should be there." He almost smiled at that. Colorado's still figuring out whether it should be there. That's what I like about it. They sat in the golden afternoon quiet, and she thought that this was the most honest conversation she had had with a man in her entire life. Lily came home 40 minutes later, breathless, and carrying a paper bag of penny candy from the general store, and looked at the two of them on the steps with the immediate sharp perception of a 12-year-old who misses nothing. She distributed the candy with a small smile and said nothing at all, which Charlotte found more eloquent than any commentary. July came with its enormous sky and its heat that was different from Boston heat, dry and clean, rather than the damp, suffocating warmth of a coastal summer. The children of Harlan's Creek were given a 2-week break from school, and Charlotte found herself with time that she did not entirely know what to do with. She helped Mrs. Ferris with the garden. She rode out alone into the surrounding country, further than she had gone before, learning the landscape with the devoted attention she had once applied to maps and illustrated accounts. She wrote long letters to her sister Margaret, and shorter, less frequent ones to her parents, who had moved from outrage to a kind of wounded puzzlement about her continued absence. A letter from her mother arrived in mid-July that contained, buried in the usual reports of social engagements and domestic news, the information that Thomas Calloway had married a Miss Porter from Marblehead and seemed very happy. Charlotte read this with a complete absence of feeling, and then wrote back to say she was glad for him. She was sitting on the boarding house porch rereading a letter from Margaret when Weston rode into town and stopped his horse in front of the building with a kind of deliberate casualness that told her the stop was not casual at all. "Miss Dugan," he said, touching his hat. His horse, a big roan, shifted under him and he settled it with one hand. "Mr. Weston." She folded her letter. "I have a problem," he said, which was clearly not easy for him to say. "Lily's been after me for 2 weeks about some book she says she needs for the reading list you gave her. I can't find it in town." "Which book?" He reached into his coat and produced a small folded piece of paper that was clearly in Lily's handwriting. Charlotte looked at it. The book was Jane Eyre, which she happened to have in her room. "I have a copy," she said. "I'll get it." She went upstairs and retrieved it, and when she came back down, Aaron was still on his horse, though he had dismounted and was standing beside it now, one hand on the reins, looking up the street with an expression she could not read. He took the book from her when she offered it, looked at the cover, then at her. "What I was going to ask," he said, and stopped. Charlotte waited. "Lily wants to come to town Saturday for the 4th of July celebration they're doing at the church. I was going to come in anyway. I wondered if you might want to ride out with us." He said it in a direct, slightly formal way, as though he had rehearsed it and was now delivering it exactly as planned. "There's a good view of the creek from the ridge east of here. Best place to watch the fireworks, if the committee has managed to get any organized." Charlotte looked at him. He met her gaze steadily, which she respected. "I would like that very much," she said. The 4th of July celebration at Harlan's Creek was not an elaborate affair. A church supper with pie and cold chicken, some patriotic speeches from the mayor and the minister that competed with each other for length and enthusiasm, a small band playing in the square, and a modest display of fireworks purchased by subscription from the dry goods merchant. The whole town turned out, as it turned out for most things, because out here community events were not optional social engagements, but the basic weave of life in a place where people depended on each other. Charlotte sat with Lily on a blanket on the ridge east of town and watched the fireworks burst above the creek, while Aaron sat beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling night air. Lily, enchanted by the lights, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees and made small sounds of delight at each burst, and Charlotte watched her face and felt a tenderness for this serious girl who had been through so much and who could still be lit up like a child by colored fire. "She doesn't show this side to most people," Aaron said quietly beside her. "I know," Charlotte said. "You've done well by her." He was quiet for a moment. "I've done what I could. It hasn't always been enough." "She's reading Bront at 12, Charlotte said, "and understanding it. That doesn't happen by accident. She felt him look at her in the dark, and then a burst of red and silver bloomed over the creek, and she looked up at it and felt his shoulder warm against hers, and neither of them moved away. August came, and with it drought. A dry, hard month that cracked the creek bed and turned the grass yellow, and put a desperate tightness into the faces of the ranchers and homesteaders who came into town. Charlotte saw it in her students, who carried the worry of their parents' households on their small shoulders, and who were sometimes too tired in the mornings to concentrate. She started keeping a tin of crackers and dried fruit in the schoolroom for the children who came hungry, buying it herself from her salary without mentioning it to anyone. Aaron's operation was small enough that the drought hit him hard. Charlotte knew this because Lily let things slip without realizing she was revealing how stretched things were at home. Small things. The fact that they were eating beans more often. The fact that Aaron had sold 2 horses he'd been planning to keep. Charlotte filed these observations away with a kind of painful helplessness, wishing she could do something and not knowing what. The crisis came in the 3rd week of August, when a stretch of fence on Aaron's north pasture gave way, and a dozen of his cattle drifted north onto land claimed by a much larger outfit, the Brennan Ranch, which ran 4 times the cattle on 4 times the ground, and whose foreman had a reputation for enforcing his borders aggressively. Charlotte heard about it from Mrs. Ferris, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had been in the street when Aaron rode in looking for help recovering his cattle before Brennan's men found them. The picture that emerged over the course of the morning was not encouraging. Brennan's foreman had already found the cattle and refused to return them without payment for use of his range, a demand that Aaron had no money to meet. Charlotte sat at her desk in the school for the morning session and taught her students, and did not let them see that she was thinking about anything else. At noon she walked to the land office, where the clerk, a dry, thin man named Patterson, confirmed that Aaron's cattle were on Brennan's land technically, though the fence failure and not any intent on Aaron's part was the cause. "Is there anything that can be done?" she asked. Patterson looked at her over his spectacles. "Legally, Brennan is within his rights to demand compensation. Whether that's the decent thing to do is a different question. Aaron's got a legitimate claim if he can show the fence was maintained and failed through weather stress rather than negligence, but making that argument would take a lawyer and time." Charlotte thought about this. Then she went to see Sheriff Talbot. Sheriff Talbot was a large, quiet man who had been the law in Harlan's Creek for 6 years, and who had the authority and reputation to make people listen. Charlotte presented the situation clearly and asked whether the sheriff might intervene in an informal capacity, not as a matter of law but as a mediator. "Brennan respects the law," the sheriff said. "He might be willing to return the cattle if I put it to him as a matter of community goodwill rather than a legal dispute. It's worth trying." Charlotte thanked him and went back to her school. That afternoon, the cattle were returned. She did not hear this directly from Aaron, but from Lily, who arrived at school the next morning bright-eyed and said that Aaron wanted to know if Miss Dugan would come to supper on Sunday. Charlotte said yes before she had finished hearing the sentence, and then composed her face into something more measured, which did not entirely fool Lily. Sunday supper at the Weston ranch was a quiet and unexpectedly moving thing. Lily cooked biscuits and a rabbit stew with the confidence of a girl who had been keeping house since she was 12, which she had been. Aaron set the table with the careful deliberateness of a man for whom having a guest was a significant occasion. The kitchen was small and warm from the stove, the windows showing the late light over the pasture, and they sat at the table together and ate and talked in the easy way that Charlotte had found she could talk to Aaron from the beginning. He thanked her for what she had done about the cattle, directly and without excessive elaboration. "I didn't do very much," she said. "The sheriff did the actual work." "You went to him," Aaron said. "I wouldn't have. I'd have let it sit and stewed about it until I came up with something on my own and probably made it worse." He said this without self-pity, with the clarity of someone who knows his own character accurately. I have trouble asking for help." "Mrs. Ferris mentioned that," Charlotte said. "She mentions a lot," he said, but not unkindly. Lily was watching them with the expression of a small judge. After supper, Lily cleared the table and then announced, with slightly too much casualness, that she was going to go check on the chickens and might be a while. Charlotte caught Aaron's eye and saw that he was trying not to smile. They sat on the porch in the evening cool and talked. Really talked. The kind of talking that Charlotte had been waiting most of her adult life to do, where you say what you actually think, and the other person responds to what you actually said instead of to what they expected you to say. Aaron talked about the land, about what he was trying to build, about what his father had planned before the fever took him, about what it had felt like at 23 to stand on 800 acres with a 12-year-old sister and no money and have to decide whether you were going to stay or go. He had stayed. He said it simply, as though it had not been a choice that required courage, which told Charlotte it absolutely had been. She talked about Boston, about her parents, about the 2 broken engagements and what they had felt like, and why she had ended them. She had never talked about any of this to anyone with complete honesty, and she found that the honesty felt like putting down something heavy she had been carrying for a long time. "Were you afraid?" he asked, "coming out here alone?" "No," she said, which worried me a little because it probably should have scared me more than it did. Why didn't it? She thought about it. Because everything I was afraid of was already where I was, being what everyone else decided I should be, wasting a life. Marrying someone for comfort when there wasn't any real wanting. Those things were the actual danger. She paused. Out here at least the dangers are honest. Weather, drought, hard work. Things I can meet directly. He looked at her for a long moment in the blue evening light with an expression she could not quite name but which made her very still. "You're not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who was playing at this, who'd last a season and go back." "I'm not going back," she said, with such simple certainty that it hung between them like a statement about something larger than geography. The night was full of crickets and the smell of sage and the far sound of his horses in the dark pasture. "No," he said, looking at her. "I don't think you are." September came and changed everything the way September does in Colorado, the cottonwoods going gold overnight, the air sharpening, the sky dropping lower and bluer, and more extravagant than it had been all summer. Charlotte moved through her days with a heightened consciousness of everything, the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves, the way the morning light hit the creek, the particular quality of the silence in the schoolroom before the children arrived. She was falling in love, and she knew it with the same quiet certainty she had known that she needed to leave Boston. A certainty that operated below the level of argument or justification, and simply was. She was also intelligent and realistic enough to know that it was not a simple thing. Aaron Weston was proud and poor and entirely absorbed in the work of keeping his land and his sister, and she had no idea whether what she felt was anything like what he felt. She was also aware of her own complicated position. A woman who had left wealth behind and who was now living modestly on a teacher's salary, and who was conscious that any appearance of pity or condescension toward Aaron would end whatever this was between them immediately and permanently. So she was careful. She continued to visit on the legitimate basis of Lily's education. She continued to have Sunday suppers when invited, which was most Sundays. She continued the conversations on the porch after supper. She noticed that Aaron looked for her when she came, that small movement of his head toward the sound of her horse, the way his whole bearing changed in a way so subtle she thought perhaps only she could see it. In the 3rd week of September, a situation arose that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or school, and everything to do with the harder realities of frontier life. A family of homesteaders named Garfield, who had settled on a claim 12 miles out of town, came in with news that their nearest neighbors, the Swanson family, had lost their harvest to a late blight and were in genuine danger of not making it through the winter. The Garfields had done what they could, but they were themselves not prosperous, and the appeal went to the town at large. Charlotte organized what she would later think of simply as the practical response. She went door to door on a Saturday, which was not a comfortable thing to do because it required asking and explaining and enduring the responses of people who had their own troubles. She brought Mrs. Ferris and the minister's wife with her, and between them they collected enough in the way of preserved food, salt, flour, and dried beans to fill a wagon. She drafted a letter to the county seat asking about emergency provisions, which Patterson at the land office helped her frame in the correct bureaucratic language. Aaron drove the wagon out with the supplies, at Charlotte's request, because he knew the road and because he was the kind of man who would. He came back that evening looking quieter than usual, and when Charlotte asked him at supper what the Swanson place had looked like, he was quiet for a moment before he said, "Like us, 2 years ago." He said it without self-pity but with a recognition that was more affecting than either would have been. "You and Lily made it," Charlotte said. "Barely." He looked at his hands on the table. "This country doesn't give anything. You have to take everything you get and be grateful for it." "You make it sound grim," she said carefully. He looked up at her. "It isn't. That's what I mean. Every single thing you get out here is worth something because you earned it. That piece of land, what I've built on it. It isn't much by any measure." He paused, and she heard something in the pause that she thought might be the edge of something he had not yet decided whether to say. "But it's real. It's mine. I'd rather have that than anything given to me." Charlotte met his eyes across the table. "I understand that," she said, "more than you might think." Lily, with her usual impeccable timing, chose this moment to upset her glass of water, and the resulting commotion broke whatever had been building at the table. But Charlotte wrote home that evening with her heart going rather faster than the gentle pace of the borrowed mare required. October arrived with the first frost, silvering the grass at dawn, and a letter from Charlotte's father. She read it alone in her room. Edmund Dugan had written in his formal, precise hand, 4 pages, and the tone was different from his earlier letters, less demanding, less outraged. He was not going to pretend he understood her choices, he wrote. He was not going to pretend he approved. But Margaret had read him portions of Charlotte's letters, and he found himself forced to admit that she sounded in these letters more herself than she had in years in his house. He wanted her to know that her quarter allowance would be restored if she wished it. He was not asking her to come home. He was simply saying the door was open. Charlotte sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. She wrote back the next morning. She thanked him for the letter and for the offer. She said she was well and happy, genuinely happy, in the way she had not previously known how to be. She said she did not need the allowance, that she was earning her own way and intended to continue doing so, but that she was grateful for the gesture and what it represented. She said she hoped they might write to each other more honestly than they had been doing. She did not mention Aaron. It was too early and too tender and too uncertain for that. The cold came down seriously in November. Charlotte found that she was better suited to cold than she had expected, that there was something clarifying about it, the way it reduced everything to essentials. She walked to school through frost-white mornings and lit the stove before the children arrived, and taught them history and arithmetic and reading, while the wind moved around the corners of the building. In the afternoons she graded work at her desk until the light failed, and then walked back to the boarding house through the early dark. She had not seen Aaron for 2 weeks when Lily came to school one Monday morning and said, without preamble, Aaron hurt his hand. Charlotte looked up from the attendance register. "How badly?" "Bad enough that he can't work properly. It got caught in the gate latch. The doctor looked at it, but he's trying to do everything himself anyway, and it's stupid." Lily said this with the particular exasperated affection of a younger sister who had been watching her brother be stubborn about his own welfare for years. Charlotte arrived at the ranch that afternoon in the last of the daylight. She had brought soup from Mrs. Ferris's kitchen, contained in a covered pot wrapped in a cloth to keep it warm, and she had brought it because it was the practical thing to do, and because she was not going to pretend any longer, even to herself, that this was only about practicality. Aaron was in the barn when she arrived, doing something one-handed and complicated with a piece of harness. His right hand was bandaged from knuckle to wrist. He looked up when he heard her horse, and the expression on his face when he saw her was something she kept in her memory for a long time afterward. It was not a masked expression. Whatever he normally kept in check in his face was momentarily not in check, and what she saw was something open and unguarded and wanting. He covered it quickly. But not quickly enough. "You didn't have to come out," he said. "I brought soup," she said, which was apparently a sufficient answer because he set down the harness. They ate at the kitchen table, Lily with them, and the conversation was easy and warm and lit by something that had not been quite as present before, some shift in the temperature of things that Charlotte thought perhaps they were both aware of. Lily, who missed nothing, was particularly quiet, watching them with those dark, serious eyes of hers. After the meal, Lily went to bed with a yawn that Charlotte was not entirely convinced was authentic. Aaron walked Charlotte out to her horse in the cold, clear night, the sky above them enormous with stars, the air smelling of pine from the ridge above the valley. He held the lantern and she adjusted her saddle, and the silence between them had a particular weight. "Charlotte," he said, and the use of her first name stopped her completely. It was the first time he had used it. She turned from the horse. He was standing in the lantern light, his bandaged hand at his side, his hat in his good hand, and she had never seen him look uncertain before, and she found that his uncertainty moved her more than anything assured could have. "I've been thinking," he started and stopped. "So have I," she said. He looked at her. "This isn't what I can offer a woman," he said. "A place like this. What you left behind in Boston, whatever it was more than this." "Don't do that," she said quietly. "What?" "Decide what I should want." She said it without heat but firmly. "I left Boston because I knew exactly what I wanted and it wasn't there. I'm not here by accident, Aaron. I'm here because I chose to be." He was very still. The lantern flame moved in a breath of wind. "I'm not a rich man," he said. "I know that. I might never be. I know that too. The land is worth something if you work it, but there are bad years. There'll be more of them." "Yes," she said, "and good ones too." He looked at her for a long moment, the light moving over his face, and then he set the lantern down on the fence post and crossed the space between them, and she met him halfway, and it was the most natural thing in the world. His good hand coming up to cup her face, her hands finding the lapels of his coat, and the kiss was not tentative or careful but real. The way everything about this place was real, direct and certain and worth having because they had both arrived at it honestly. When they separated, she was aware of the cold and the stars and the sound of his horses in the barn, and she was aware that she was completely happy. "I've been in love with you," he said, with the blunt simplicity of a man who has decided to say a true thing, "since you rode out here with those books for Lily and told me she was worth something." "She is worth something," Charlotte said, "and so are you." He kissed her again, and she tasted the cold air in it, and when they finally separated, she rested her forehead briefly against his chin, and he held her with the same careful strength he brought to everything he did. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was hard in the way that Colorado winters were consistently hard, long and gray, and requiring everything you had. Charlotte kept teaching. Aaron kept ranching, his hand healing and then plunging back into the enormous physical labor that the property required of him. They saw each other regularly, riding between the ranch and town through cold that cracked the air, and what had begun on that night in the lantern light grew steadily into something neither of them doubted. Lily watched the whole thing with a quiet approval that she expressed primarily through the quality of her biscuits at Sunday suppers, which improved measurably through the autumn. Charlotte's relationship with Aaron was not secret, exactly, because in a town the size of Harlan's Creek nothing was secret, but it was also not announced. It was simply present, visible to anyone who paid attention, two people who were together in the easy, constant way of people who have made a decision about each other and are living inside it. Mrs. Ferris, who paid attention to everything, said nothing at all for 3 months, and then one evening over supper remarked that Weston was the most honest man she had known in 20 years in this country, which Charlotte understood was the highest endorsement the woman was capable of giving. The town's reaction was mixed in the way these things are in small places. Most people liked Aaron, and most people had come to like Charlotte and saw no obstacle. A few people, the kind who catalogued other people's business as a primary occupation, wondered aloud what a woman of Charlotte's obvious education and evident background was doing attaching herself to a man who could barely keep his ranch solvent. Charlotte heard these comments through the usual channels of a small town and gave them no attention whatsoever. One comment, however, was harder to dismiss. In January, the wife of the land merchant, a woman named Mrs. Alcott, who had strong opinions about social arrangements and the courage of her convictions, cornered Charlotte after church to say, with the particular cruelty of someone who believes they are being kind, "You do understand, don't you, that if things are as you hope with Mr. Weston, you'll be taking on not just a struggling property but a child to raise as well. That girl has nowhere else to go." Charlotte looked at Mrs. Alcott for a moment. "I know that," she said. "Lily is one of the reasons I'm not ambivalent about any of it." She walked away before Mrs. Alcott could respond. That evening she rode out to the ranch and found Aaron splitting wood in the last of the daylight, and she sat on the fence and watched him work, and when he stopped and came over with an inquiring look she told him what Mrs. Alcott had said. His expression went through several things in quick succession. Anger, which he managed, then something uncomfortable which was harder to manage. "She's not wrong about Lily," he said carefully. "I'm raising her. I'll be raising her for another 6 years at least. That's part of what this is." "I know it is," Charlotte said. "Aaron, I have spent 6 months watching you with that girl. I know what she means to you and I know what you've sacrificed for her. That doesn't frighten me. That's part of why I trust you." He looked at her with that stillness he had, that quality of total attention. "She already calls you Miss Charlotte," he said. "I know. She told me last week that you were the best teacher in Colorado." He paused. "She hasn't given that kind of opinion about anyone except the horses." Charlotte laughed, which was the sound of genuine delight, and he watched her laugh with an expression she recognized now as the way he looked when he was at his happiest, and did not know entirely what to do with it. February brought a blizzard that kept Harlan's Creek locked under 3 feet of snow for 4 days. The school was closed. Charlotte helped Mrs. Ferris tend to an elderly neighbor who could not manage the cold, and she read and she wrote to Margaret, and she thought about the future with the focused attention she had once applied to maps. On the 5th day, when the road was barely passable, Aaron came into town on horseback through the cleared track and came to the boarding house and asked if he could speak with Charlotte privately. Mrs. Ferris showed them to the parlor with the discretion of a woman who had seen a great deal and judged very little. Aaron was wearing his good coat, which Charlotte had only seen once before. He stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands with the same careful deliberateness he brought to things that mattered to him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. Not asked, not quite yet, but stated as a preamble as though he needed to lay the ground first. "I want to tell you what that means before I ask, because you deserve to know exactly what you'd be taking on." "All right," Charlotte said. "The ranch has 840 acres. About 600 of it is usable pasture land. I run 112 head of cattle, which is less than I should be running, but what the drought left me. I have 2 good horses and 2 older ones. The house is in fair shape, needs work on the south wall. I have no debt except what I owe the feed store, which I'll clear in spring when I sell. I have no savings to speak of, maybe $40. He stopped. "That's what I have." Charlotte was very still. "Is that all you wanted to say?" "No." He stopped again, and the things that were never difficult for him, the physical courage, the hard work, the endurance, fell away and left something simple and exposed. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since August at least, probably before. I love the way you think and the way you talk and the way you look at Lily when you're teaching her something and she gets it. I love that you came out here on your own and made something of it and didn't complain about the hard parts." He paused. I love you and I don't have much to offer except that it's real and it'll last." Charlotte crossed the room and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and when she drew back she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." "I haven't actually asked yet," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost laughter. "Then ask. Charlotte Dugan, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said again. "Aaron Weston, yes." He held her then, his arms around her in the cold parlor of Mrs. Ferris's boarding house, with the snow outside and the fire on the hearth, and she felt the full solidity of him, the realness of his presence, and thought that this was what she had been trying to find the name for since she first sat on that porch step beside him. They told Lily that evening. Lily received the news sitting at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her, looked up at both of them and said, with perfect 12-year-old composure, "It's about time." Then she put the book down and hugged Charlotte with a fierceness that said everything her composure was trying not to. Charlotte wrote to her parents. She wrote the letter with care, explaining not just the fact of her engagement but the reasons for it, describing Aaron not in the terms she thought her parents would understand, but in the terms she thought were accurate. An honest man, a hardworking man, a man of genuine character and integrity who had built something real under difficult conditions, and who had treated her from the first moment as an equal capable of making her own decisions. She asked them to trust her judgment, which she acknowledged she had not always made easy for them to do. Her father's reply came 6 weeks later. It was shorter than she expected and more generous. He said that if she was certain, and it was clear from her letter that she was, then he wished her well. He said that he would like to meet this man she spoke of so highly, and that if they came east at any point the house was open to them. He enclosed a check for $50 as a wedding gift, which Charlotte looked at for a long time before folding it and setting it carefully aside. She wrote back to tell him what the money would do. It would repair the south wall of the house and purchase 2 additional heifers for the spring. She described these projects with the same precision she would have brought to any accounting, because she wanted him to understand that this was her life now, and she was living it with the full engagement of her intelligence, and that there was nothing to mourn in any of it. Margaret wrote separately, a long, exuberant letter that was entirely unlike their father's careful note, full of exclamation and delight, and the explicit declaration that she had known for months from Charlotte's letters that something was happening out there, and wasn't it wonderful? She said she wanted to visit. Charlotte wrote back and said she absolutely should. They married on a Saturday in April of 1879, a year and 2 days after Charlotte had stepped off the stagecoach into the dust of Harlan's Creek. The ceremony was in the small white church, performed by the minister, with Mrs. Ferris and Lily standing up with Charlotte and the blacksmith, who was one of Aaron's few close friends, standing with Aaron. Most of the town came. Colorado spring was doing its best outside, the cottonwoods along the creek in new leaf, the sky the particular impossible blue it turned in April. Charlotte wore a dress she had made with the help of Mrs. Ferris and 3 other women of the town, a cream wool with a small floral print, practical enough to be worn again and pretty enough for the occasion. She had done her own hair, the chestnut mass of it pinned up with the small pearl combs her mother had sent in a package that had arrived the week before, which Charlotte received as the gesture it was intended to be. Aaron stood at the front of the church with his hat off and his good coat on, and his dark eyes fixed on her as she came through the door, and the expression on his face was something Charlotte thought she would be able to draw from memory for the rest of her life. The vows were the traditional ones. Charlotte said them looking directly into his eyes and meant every word with the straightforward completeness of someone who did not give promises lightly. Afterward there was food and music in the church hall, the small community band playing reels and waltzes, people dancing on the wooden floor, children running in circles, the particular warmth of a celebration in a place where celebrations are appreciated because they are rare. Aaron danced with Charlotte in a way that told her he had danced before, but not recently, solid and slightly careful, his hand at her waist with the particular attentiveness of someone who has just acquired something precious. He was not a man given to public displays of feeling, but when the song ended and they stood close together in the thinning crowd, he looked at her with everything in his face that he usually kept contained, and she rose up on her toes and kissed him on the cheek, and he caught her hand and held it. Lily danced with the blacksmith's son, a boy her own age named Tobias, with the dignified concentration of a girl who was taking the occasion seriously. Mrs. Ferris watched the whole thing with her arms folded, and her expression of someone who considers their investment well placed. They moved Charlotte's things to the ranch that same day, or rather the essentials of them, her books, her clothes, her writing things, a small painting Margaret had sent as a gift. The rest would come over the following weeks. She stood in the bedroom of the low adobe house in the late afternoon light, Aaron beside her, both of them tired from the day, and looked at the window with its view of the south pasture and the ridge beyond it. "Well," Aaron said. "Well," Charlotte agreed. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood there looking out at their land in the Colorado evening. The spring and summer of 1879 were the beginning of everything. Charlotte taught through the spring term and continued teaching into the fall, unwilling to abandon the school until a replacement could be found, and found that the combination of teaching and ranch life was demanding and satisfying in a way that nothing in her previous experience had prepared her for. She rose early, helped Aaron with morning chores before the walk to school, came home in the afternoon to help with the evening work, and fell into sleep with the clean tiredness of someone who had used every hour of the day for something real. They worked well together. Charlotte discovered that she had a genuine aptitude for the record-keeping and financial management side of the ranch, which Aaron had been doing in a rough and instinctive way, but which became more systematic under her attention. She began keeping detailed accounts, tracking expenses and income, identifying where the small margins could be widened. She also proved useful with the cattle in ways that surprised both of them, not in the physical work of ranching, which required experience and strength she did not have, but in the management decisions when to sell, where to buy feed, how to balance the herd. Aaron watched her apply her intelligence to his enterprise with a kind of wonder that he expressed primarily by deferring to her judgment more often than she expected, and by saying, after her first successful recommendation to hold cattle through a period of falling prices that then reversed, "You should have been running this place from the start." "You were doing all right," Charlotte said. "I was surviving," he said. "There's a difference." That summer, Aaron took on 2 seasonal hands, which was more than he had managed before, young men from a homesteader family whose own operation was not yet producing. The additional labor let him clear land on the north section that had been too rough to use, adding usable acreage to his productive range. Charlotte found a replacement teacher in September of that year, a young man named Elias Hammond who had just completed his schooling in Denver and was looking for a first posting. She spent 2 weeks with him in the classroom, passing on what she had learned, which she had come to think of as considerable, and she felt the clean completion of something when she watched him take over the morning session, and the children respond to him with the cautious openness children extend to new authority. She was not lost without the teaching. The ranch expanded to fill the time, and there was a great deal the ranch required. She also began writing, something she had not done seriously since leaving Boston, essays and observations about frontier life that she sent to a women's magazine in Denver that published a quarterly. The editor wrote back to say he would take 3 of them, and Charlotte received this news sitting at the kitchen table with Aaron and Lily at supper, and had to work to keep the smile from being overwhelming. Aaron read the essays before she sent them, which she offered, and he accepted with a seriousness that told her he understood what they meant to her. His comments were spare and accurate and entirely without condescension. He was not a literary man, but he was an honest reader, and his honesty was worth more to her than elaborate praise. Lily turned 13 in October and came into the house one afternoon in November with the particular expression of a girl navigating the complicated dignity of growing up, and told Charlotte she wanted to learn to do accounts properly, not just arithmetic but actual bookkeeping, because she intended to manage her own affairs someday. Charlotte sat down with her that same afternoon and began. Their first Christmas as a married couple was quiet and fine. Aaron cut a small pine from the ridge and they decorated it with bits of ribbon and some paper stars that Lily made. Charlotte cooked a meal she had been planning for a week, roast chicken and sweet potatoes and a dried apple pie whose pastry, she was quietly satisfied to note, was the equal of anything Mrs. Ferris produced. They exchanged gifts at the table after dinner, small things. A good pen for Charlotte from Aaron, who had ridden to the county seat to find it. A book for Lily. A new work knife for Aaron that Charlotte had ordered through the general store. After Lily went to bed, Charlotte and Aaron sat by the fire with the evening quiet around them and the pine tree shedding its faint resinous smell into the room, and he reached over and took her hand without any particular ceremony, and they sat like that for a long time, which was more eloquent than anything either of them might have said. In the spring of 1880, Charlotte realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for 2 weeks before she said anything to Aaron, turning the knowledge over in her private mind with a kind of careful wonder, testing the feeling of it against her sense of herself, and finding that it fit, that it was something she wanted with the same unambiguous directness with which she wanted everything that was now hers. She told him on a morning in early April before breakfast, when they were both standing in the kitchen and the light was coming through the east window in that clean, early way it had before the day warmed up. She simply said it directly, the way she said everything important. He was very still for a moment. Then he turned from the window and looked at her with an expression that was several things at once: joy and something that was almost fear, because this was one more person who could be lost, and then joy again, larger, overcoming the fear. "Charlotte," he said, and her name in his voice was the whole sentence. She crossed the kitchen to him and he held her against his chest and she felt him breathe. "When?" he managed. "October, I think. I'll see the doctor to be sure." He held her in the morning kitchen light and she felt his heart beating and thought that this was what she had come west for. Not precisely this moment, but the kind of life that could contain it. The news spread through the small community of their lives in the usual way. Mrs. Ferris received it with a satisfaction that was as close to sentiment as she came. Lily, who was now 13 and had the self-possession of someone considerably older, absorbed the information with a quick series of expressions and then said, "I'll help," with such complete certainty that Charlotte laughed. The summer of 1880 was good to them. The rains came in the right amounts. The cattle sold at fair prices. Aaron bought a good piece of fence material and used the seasonal hands to extend the north boundary, claiming more of the ridge land that had been borderline range. Charlotte wrote more essays, corresponded with the Denver editor about a longer piece, and spent the long summer evenings on the porch in the warm dark with Aaron beside her, watching the stars come up over the ridge, her hand resting on the growing evidence of their life together. She wrote to her parents regularly now, with a transparency that had not been possible before. Her father's letters in reply had softened considerably over 2 years, and in one of them he admitted, in the careful language of a man not accustomed to being wrong, that he had not understood what she was looking for and perhaps could not have, but that her letters suggested she had found it and he was glad. Her mother's letters were warmer and asked detailed questions about the house and the garden, which Charlotte answered with a pleasure that surprised her. She found she could think about Boston now without the old constriction, which meant she had gotten far enough away from what had been wrong there that it had lost its power to disturb her. Margaret visited in August of 1880, arriving on the stagecoach with 3 bags and an expression of absolute delight that did not dim for the entire 2 weeks she stayed. She was 21, dark-haired and lively, and she took one look at the ranch and Aaron Weston and said to Charlotte in private, "Oh, I see completely." She helped with everything, got along with Lily immediately and effortlessly, pestered Aaron with questions about cattle and range management that he answered with more patience than Charlotte had expected, and left at the end of 2 weeks saying she would be back before she even reached the stagecoach. Aaron said, after she had gone, that Margaret was the most relentlessly cheerful person he had ever encountered. "She has always been like that," Charlotte said, "even when things were difficult. She just decided early that the world was interesting and hasn't reconsidered." "Good trait," Aaron said, and Charlotte heard in this the same quality that had drawn her to him from the beginning, the ability to recognize something true in someone else without any need to diminish it. Their son was born in October of 1880, on a cold, clear Tuesday morning with the smell of frost in the air, and the cottonwoods already bare on the creek line. The doctor came from town in time, which was fortunate, and the birth was hard in the way these things are but without serious complication. Aaron was in the house throughout, which was not universally the custom, but Charlotte had wanted him there, and he was not a man to be elsewhere when the people he loved needed him. They named the boy Thomas Edmund Weston, the first name for no particular reason except that it suited him, which was evident almost immediately, and the second for Charlotte's father, which they had discussed, and which she thought was right. Edmund Dugan received this news in a letter that Charlotte wrote 3 days after the birth, still tired and completely happy, and he replied with a letter that was the warmest he had written to her since she left Boston, and which contained the simple acknowledgment that he was honored. Thomas Edmund Weston was from his first days a substantial and serious baby, dark-eyed like his father and dark-haired like both of them, with a quality of intent observation that made the doctor joke he was already taking notes. Lily was besotted, with a devotion that was both fierce and unexpectedly gentle, and Charlotte watched her with this small new person and felt a love for the girl that was different from what she felt for Aaron but no less real. Aaron with the baby was something she had not anticipated and would not forget. He held his son with the careful precision he brought to important things, and he talked to him in a low voice that was nothing like his public voice, a quiet private voice that told stories about the land and the horses, and what the spring calving was going to look like, and what the boy would do when he was big enough to ride. Charlotte would sometimes stop in a doorway and listen to this, and feel something expand in her chest that had no name. The winter of 1880 into 1881 passed in the particular way of winters, with a new baby, exhausting and warm and full of small moments that felt significant in their smallness. The ranch ran well enough through the cold months. Aaron had laid in sufficient feed in the fall, better planning than in previous years, and the cattle came through without major losses. By the spring of 1881, the Weston ranch had changed considerably from the struggling outfit Aaron had inherited. The herd had grown to just over 160 head. The house had been expanded with a new room on the east side, which Charlotte had designed with Aaron's help, something large enough to hold a real bookshelf and a proper desk. The accounts were in order, the debt to the feed store long cleared, a modest amount in savings at the bank in the county seat. They were not rich. Charlotte did not want them to be rich in the sense she had been raised to understand wealth, that accumulated mass of possessions and social position that requires constant maintenance, and that had always felt to her like a kind of imprisonment. They were comfortable. They were stable. They had enough, and enough had turned out to be a word with far more richness in it than she had previously suspected. The essay Charlotte published in the spring of 1881 in the Denver Quarterly was the longest piece she had written, 14 pages about the experience of leaving the East and building a life in Colorado, written with the honesty and specificity that had made the earlier pieces successful. The editor wrote to say it was the best thing he had published in 2 years and asked if she would consider a regular column. She wrote back to say she would and told Aaron that evening at supper. He looked at her across the table with the full warmth of his attention. "You knew you were a writer," he said. "I thought I was. It's different knowing it and doing it. You've been doing it for 2 years." "Yes," she said, "with your support." He shook his head slightly. A small motion she had learned meant he was dismissing credit he thought was being misplaced. "You did that yourself." "Aaron," she said. "I ran a one-room school for a year and a half and helped manage this ranch and raised your sister and had a baby and wrote essays in the gaps between all of it. I couldn't have done that if you had made it harder." She met his eyes. "You made it easier, every day." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You make everything here easier than it's ever been." Lily, who was 14 by now, and had the complete and self-contained dignity of someone who has been required to grow up early and done so with grace, looked at both of them and went back to her biscuit with the small, satisfied expression of someone whose household is as it should be. The summer of 1881 brought Margaret West again, this time with a young man she was considering marrying, a civil engineer named Charles Walsh, who had an earnest quality and a genuine willingness to get his hands dirty that Charlotte thought well of immediately. Aaron took him out to the North Range and came back looking thoughtful, and said to Charlotte that night that Charles was more capable than he appeared, which from Aaron was high praise. Margaret and Charles were married in Boston in September of that year, and Charlotte could not make the journey with a baby not yet a year old and the ranch demanding its fall attention. But she wrote the most affectionate letter she had ever written to her sister, and sent it with a small piece of Colorado turquoise she had found on the ridge that summer, which she thought was the most beautiful thing she owned. Thomas Edmund was walking by his first birthday in October of 1881, a determined and serious walking, both arms out, face set in concentration. He had Aaron's quality of attention and Charlotte's habit of attempting things without asking whether they were possible. Lily taught him the names of the horses. Aaron taught him at the first reasonable opportunity to sit on the front of the saddle while his father rode, and Charlotte watched from the fence with her heart in her mouth and her face composed into an expression that suggested she was perfectly calm. Aaron caught her expression when he brought the horse back and said, with the small straight smile she had learned to love, "He's fine." "I know he's fine," Charlotte said. "I'm also fine." "You look fine," Aaron agreed, entirely unconvincingly, and she threw her hat at him, which he caught. The years that followed were the years of building. Not in a dramatic sense, not the kind of building that makes stories because of its violence or its extremity, but the slower and in its own way more profound building of a life that becomes what you wanted it to be. Aaron expanded the herd further, reaching 200 head by 1883, a number that required hiring on a permanent hand for the first time. A taciturn young man of about 20 named Eli Cole, who had grown up on a ranch in Texas, and who rode with the natural ease of someone who had been on a horse before he could walk. Charlotte's column in the Denver Quarterly had by 1882 attracted enough attention to be syndicated in 2 other Western papers, which brought a small additional income and a larger correspondence from readers who found in her practical and honest voice something they recognized. She was not famous, which she did not want to be, but she was read, and she found that being read was a particular kind of connection that mattered to her more than she had expected. Lily turned 16 in 1883 and began corresponding with the woman who ran the school in Denver, where Charlotte had helped her apply for a scholarship. She was accepted in the spring of 1884, and the summer before she left was a complicated thing for all of them. Charlotte and Lily had arrived at the particular friendship that is possible between a woman and a girl who is almost a woman, something that had grown from the teacher-student beginning through all the years of shared household and shared life, and become its own genuine thing. Aaron was proud of Lily in the way of someone who had sacrificed to make a thing possible, and is vindicated by seeing it happen. But the pride sat alongside something Charlotte recognized as the same thing he had felt when she had first told him she was pregnant. That vulnerability of someone who has more to lose now than he started with. The night before Lily left for Denver, the three of them sat on the porch after Thomas was in bed, and Charlotte held Aaron's hand in the dark and did not say anything in particular, because there was nothing in particular to say, and the sitting together was enough. Lily wrote every week from Denver, long letters full of her ideas and her reading and her opinions about everything. She was, Charlotte had always known, exceptional, and it was satisfying beyond measure to see it confirmed by people who had no particular reason to be generous. Charlotte was pregnant again by the spring of 1884. This second pregnancy was easier in some ways and harder in others. Easier because she knew what was happening to her body and was less surprised by it. Harder because Thomas was now 3.5 and had opinions about most things and required constant engagement. She continued the column through the summer, writing at her desk in the East Room in the evenings while Aaron read and Thomas slept. Their second child was a girl, born in August of 1884 on a hot evening with a thunderstorm on the ridge, which Aaron later claimed was entirely appropriate given her subsequent personality. They named her Clara Ann Weston, the second name for Charlotte's mother, which was received in Boston with a letter that was the warmest Vivienne had ever written to her daughter, and which Charlotte kept. Clara was from the beginning the opposite of her brother in temperament. Where Thomas was careful and serious, Clara was immediate and loud and fearless. She had Charlotte's gray eyes and Aaron's dark hair, and an expression from the first weeks of her life that suggested she was going to have things her way, and was merely allowing her present limitations out of courtesy. Aaron held her in the morning light and looked at Charlotte with that same full helpless joy he had shown when Thomas was born, that slight widening of everything in him that he could not contain, and Charlotte thought she would never stop loving him for the way he loved the people in his life. By 1885, the Weston Ranch was one of the more stable small operations in the county. Not the largest, not the wealthiest, but a place that worked and that was known to work. Aaron had the reputation that Charlotte had known from the beginning he deserved, of a man whose word meant what it said, whose land was well managed, whose dealings were fair. He had been asked twice to serve on the county land board and had declined the first time and accepted the second, because the second time Charlotte told him directly that his voice was needed there and that he should go. He went, and proved useful, as she had known he would. Charlotte's parents came west in the summer of 1885. Edmund and Vivienne Dugan made the journey by rail to Denver and then by hired coach to Harlan's Creek, a journey that Vivienne found alarming and Edmund found fascinating. And they arrived at the Weston Ranch on a July afternoon in a cloud of Colorado dust looking somewhat wrinkled but essentially intact. Charlotte watched her father get down from the coach and look at the property with the assessing eye of a man who understands value, and she saw the moment when he understood that what his daughter had was real, not large, not elaborate, but real and solid and built on something true. Edmund Dugan shook Aaron Weston's hand and said something quiet to him that Charlotte did not hear, and Aaron looked at her father with the direct steadiness she knew so well and replied in kind, and something was settled between them in that handshake that Charlotte thought had been needing to be settled for 7 years. Vivienne Dugan took one look at Thomas and Clara and put out her arms, and the children, who had been instructed to be on their best behavior and had prepared for this by being very clean, both went to her with the easy confidence of children who have been loved well and know it. The 2 weeks of the visit were not without their awkward moments. Edmund's instinct was to problem solve, and his solutions to problems tended to involve the application of money, and he had to learn, over several quiet conversations with Charlotte, that the problems of this life were not best solved that way and that offering money was more complicated than it seemed. He learned this with more grace than Charlotte had expected of him, and on the third day she caught him talking to Aaron about fence management with what appeared to be genuine interest, and she thought that her father might have been a different man in a different world, a man who found satisfaction in building things rather than in the management of accumulated wealth, and that this world had simply not offered him that option. They said goodbye on a bright morning with the summer going gold around them, and Edmund Dugan held his daughter for a long moment and said, against her hair, "I was wrong about what you needed." He stepped back and looked at her. "I'm glad you were stubborn enough to go ahead anyway." "I got that from you," Charlotte said. He almost laughed. He shook Aaron's hand again and climbed into the coach. The ranch continued to grow through the late 1880s, steadily and without drama, which was exactly what Charlotte wanted from it. She bought 3 additional horses with money from her writing income, investing it back into the property in a way that gave her a particular satisfaction. She and Aaron discussed every significant decision together, not because he needed her permission, but because they had built the habit of thinking together and found it produced better results than thinking separately. Lily graduated from the Denver School in 1887 and came home for a summer before taking a teaching position in a larger town to the north, and the summer she spent at the ranch was one of Charlotte's favorites. The house full in a way it only was when Lily was there, her particular sharp intelligence and dry humor filling the rooms. She was 22 and had grown into the exceptional person Charlotte had always seen in her, and Aaron looked at his sister with a pride so large it was almost impractical. Thomas was 7 in 1887 and was in school, taking to it with the same deliberate seriousness he brought to everything. Clara was 3 and was attending to her education outside of school with characteristic force, demanding explanations for everything and accepting none that were not satisfying. She had discovered Charlotte's books and treated them with a respect for their importance if not always their bindings. Aaron turned 35 in 1888, and Charlotte threw him a supper that included every person in their daily life, the seasonal hands, Mrs. Ferris, who had become a genuine friend, the blacksmith and his wife, the sheriff who had retired from his position and was now farming on land south of town, Eli Cole, who had been with them now for 5 years and who considered himself, correctly, part of the operation. They sat around long tables in the yard in the warm August evening and ate and talked, and Aaron looked around the table at all of it with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not imagine reaching. He said to Charlotte that night when the guests were gone and the children were asleep and they sat on the porch in the dark, "I didn't think it would look like this." "Like what?" she asked. "Like this." He gestured at the dark property around them, at the house with its new room and its repaired south wall, at the barn with its horses quiet inside, at the land stretching off into the Colorado dark. "I thought I'd just be keeping it going, just surviving it. I didn't think there'd be all this." He paused. "I didn't think there'd be you." Charlotte leaned her head against his shoulder. "I didn't think there'd be this either," she said. "I thought there'd be something true. I didn't know what shape it would be." "Are you glad?" he asked. She turned to look at him in the dark. This man she had ridden out to see with a bag of books. This man who had repaired his own fence and raised his sister, and held his land through drought and hard winters, and the ordinary grinding difficulty of a life that asks everything of you, who had loved her with a completeness and a consistency that she had come to understand was rarer than diamonds. She took his face in her hands the way she had in that Boston parlor 7 years ago. "Aaron Weston," she said, "I am the happiest I have ever been or expected to be. I am precisely where I chose to be and with precisely the person I chose to be with. Yes, I am glad." He kissed her, long and slow in the August dark, and she tasted on him the particular quality of the man she loved, that directness, that honesty, everything exactly what it was. Lily came back to visit in the winter of 1889, and this time she brought a young man, a doctor named Samuel Park, who had a practice in the town where she was teaching and who looked at Lily with an expression Aaron and Charlotte both recognized. Aaron conducted a lengthy conversation with him about land and medicine and the territorial situation, and came back to Charlotte afterward and said, with characteristic brevity, "He's a good man." Coming from Aaron, this was not faint praise. Samuel Park asked for Lily's hand that winter and she gave it to him, and the wedding was in the spring of 1890 in the town where they both worked. A modest and beautiful ceremony that Charlotte attended with Aaron and both children. And she sat in the small church and watched Lily become a married woman, and felt the full completion of something that had begun with a bag of books and a ride south along a creek. Thomas was 10 in 1890, and he rode with his father now with confidence, helping with the lighter ranch work, learning everything with the same methodical attention Aaron brought to things. Clara was 6 and had started school with the same forceful enthusiasm she brought to everything, and her teacher, the young man who had eventually replaced the man who replaced Charlotte, sent a note home in the first month saying Clara was exceptional and also somewhat overwhelming. Aaron read this note and handed it back to Charlotte and said, "Wonder where she gets that." Charlotte kept her face entirely neutral. No idea. The 1890s were prosperous years for the ranch, more prosperous than the difficult years of building had allowed Charlotte to fully imagine. The cattle prices were better. The rains came in more reasonable proportions. Aaron's reputation in the county was such that younger ranchers sought his advice, and he gave it honestly and without condescension, which was the only way he knew how to give anything. Charlotte's column had by 1891 been running for 10 years, and the Denver Quarterly's editor, a different man now from the one who had first published her, asked her to consider collecting the pieces into a book. She spent the winter of 1891 into 1892 organizing and editing, working at her desk in the East Room while the Colorado cold settled over the land, and the fire kept the room warm and Aaron read in the chair on the other side of the fire, and the house was quiet around them with the particular piece of a place where the people in it are exactly where they want to be. The book was published in Denver in 1892, a modest production, 200 copies with a plain cover and her name on it. Charlotte Weston. Not Dugan anymore, or not only, though Dugan was still part of her in all the ways it always would be. Charlotte Weston, who had come west on a dream and found that the dream was more specific and more real than she had known how to imagine when she set out. Edmund Dugan received a copy in Boston and wrote to say he had read it twice, and that it was, in his careful estimation, the finest thing he had read in years. Vivienne wrote a separate note to say she had cried through parts of it and was putting it on the parlor table where everyone could see it. Charlotte held both letters and thought that distance, real distance, the kind you travel into yourself as well as across a continent, had a way of making things possible between people that closeness had prevented. Aaron read the book. He did not say a great deal about it, which Charlotte had come to understand was not absence of response, but the particular shape of his response, the way deep feeling in him tended to go inward rather than outward. But he carried the copy she gave him with him for several weeks, and she found it once on his side of the bed with a page marked, and when she looked at the page it was the essay she had written about the first time she rode out to the ranch, the morning she had seen it from the rise before the valley, that first sight of it in the Colorado light, and she had written about that sight with all the truth she had. She looked at the marked page and put the book back exactly as she had found it and never mentioned it to him. Thomas was 12 in 1892 and was already the kind of person he was going to be, careful and honest and genuinely good, with his father's quality of doing what he said he would do and his mother's habit of thinking things through before committing to them. Clara was 8 and was already ungovernable in the best possible sense, full of opinions and ambitions, and the absolute confidence of someone who has been loved without condition. The spring of 1893 brought a particular joy. Lily wrote to say she was expecting a child, due in the summer, and Aaron received this letter at the breakfast table and read it and then read it again and looked out the window for a moment with his jaw slightly working, which was what emotion did to him when it was large. "Lily is going to have a baby," he said to Charlotte, as though she had not already read it over his shoulder. "I know," Charlotte said. He looked at her across the breakfast table. Thomas was eating without appearing to notice anything. Clara was watching her father with keen assessment. "Uncle Aaron," Clara said, testing the sound of it. "Yes," he said. "I like that," she said, and went back to her biscuit. The baby was born in July of 1893, a boy they named James Aaron Park, the second name Aaron's, which he learned from Lily's letter, and which required him to leave the kitchen for a few minutes and come back with his face composed. Charlotte left him the minutes without comment and poured more coffee when he came back. The summer of 1893 was the summer Charlotte turned 40, though she did not mark it with any great ceremony, because she had never attached much weight to years as measures of things. Aaron, who had turned 40 the previous year with the same lack of ceremony, made her a supper that he cooked himself, which was an act of courage since cooking was not his strongest suit, and the results were more successful than their occasional previous experiments had suggested they would be. Thomas and Clara made a card that Clara had illustrated with drawings of horses and what appeared to be a barn, and which Thomas had inscribed with a sentiment of such earnest affection that Charlotte kept it in her writing desk. They rode out together that afternoon, just the two of them, up the ridge south of the ranch, to the place that had always been their place, a flat rock shelf that looked north over the valley and the town in the distance and the great sweep of the country beyond. They had come here many times over the years, and the view was one Charlotte had drawn in her memory so many times she thought she could reproduce it with her eyes closed. They sat on the rock in the summer warmth and looked at the country they lived in, the golden grass and the dark ridge line and the far blue mountains and the enormous Colorado sky. 20 years ago today, Aaron said, which was not quite accurate since she had not arrived in Harlan's Creek until late April and they were sitting here in June, but Charlotte understood what he meant. "You were in Boston." "Yes," she said. What do you think that Charlotte would think of this? She considered it. She thought about the woman she had been at 24, sitting in the Boston Athenaeum tracing rivers on maps, burning with something she could not name, certain only that it was not where she was. She thought about what that woman had imagined the West would be, some combination of the practical and the wild and the honest. "I think she would be surprised," Charlotte said. "Not by the place. I think she knew this was real, but by how completely right it is." She paused. She had a sense that there was something waiting for her out here, but she thought it was a dream, a place or an idea. She didn't know it was a person. Aaron looked at her with everything in his face. "You were the dream," she said simply. "The land and the life and the work are all real and all true, and I love all of it. But you were the dream. You were what I couldn't have named before I found you." He took her hand, which was warm and calloused from years of work she had never expected to do and had never wanted to stop doing, and they sat on the ridge in the high summer warmth with the country spread below them, all of it real, all of it earned, all of it exactly what it needed to be. Clara's laugh came up from somewhere below, where she and Thomas had ridden with them and dismounted to explore the creek bed at the base of the ridge, her voice clear and bright in the warm air, full of the uncomplicated joy of a child who knows she is exactly where she belongs. Aaron squeezed Charlotte's hand and did not need to say anything. The years continued in the way that good years do, full and various, and not without their difficulties, but shaped by something fundamental that held. Thomas grew into a young man of 20 who announced in 1900 that he wanted to study agriculture at the Colorado Agricultural College in Fort Collins, which Aaron greeted with a pride that took several days to settle into something he could talk about without his voice changing. Charlotte wrote him a letter of the most concentrated love she had ever put on paper, about what it meant to make a deliberate choice about your life and go toward what you actually wanted. And when Thomas read it at the kitchen table, he had to fold it and put it in his shirt pocket and look out the window for a while before he could speak. Clara was 16 in 1900 and was, to the continued amazement of everyone who had not been watching it happen, even more herself than she had been at 6. She had her mother's intelligence and her father's honesty, and some quality entirely her own that she expressed primarily through an insistence on engaging with everything at full force. She had read everything in Charlotte's library twice. She wrote essays and letters with a facility that Charlotte recognized as genuine gift. She had opinions about everything from the cattle market to the territorial politics to the literature of the previous century, and she expressed them clearly and without apology. Aaron watched his daughter and said to Charlotte privately that she was going to be formidable. "She already is," Charlotte said. "God help whoever falls in love with her," he said. But he said it with the warmth of a man who loves the people who are going to make other people's lives complicated. Lily came to visit in the summer of 1900 with James, now 7, and a second child, a daughter named Rose who was 4. The ranch was full in the way Charlotte loved it most, voices in every room, children underfoot, the large, complicated, happy chaos of people who belonged to each other gathered in one place. Aaron moved through it all with a quiet contentment that was deeper than happiness, the kind of settled rightness that comes only to people who have built something real and know it. Charlotte watched him at the supper table, this man who had been 25 and broke and alone on 800 difficult acres, when she rode up to his fence with a bag of books, who had turned to look at her with those dark eyes, and said her name for the first time on a porch in the evening, and changed the shape of her life irrevocably. She watched him talking to Samuel about county affairs while James sat on his knee, and Clara was arguing with Lily about something both of them found interesting, and Thomas was laughing at something Eli Cole had said, all of it happening in the light of the lamp over the table, and she thought that this was what she had been trying to find the words for since she first understood she was happy here. She had left everything she was supposed to want. She had crossed a continent with 2 carpet bags and a letter of introduction, and arrived in a town that smelled of horses and dust, and had a dog sleeping in the middle of the road. She had ridden out on a borrowed mare to bring books to a girl who needed them and had found, leaning on a corral fence in a worn canvas coat, a man who was everything she had not known she was looking for. She had found a life that was real in every sense of the word, hard and beautiful, and full of work that meant something, full of people she had chosen and who had chosen her, full of the kind of love that does not ask you to be smaller than you are, but grows to meet the size of who you actually want to be. Aaron looked up from across the table and caught her eye and held it for a moment, that particular look between them, quiet and full and complete, the look of 2 people who have found each other in the biggest possible sense and know it every day. She raised her coffee cup slightly, just a small motion, a private toast. He almost smiled, the smile that she had been collecting all these years. Outside, the Colorado night spread over the land they had built together, over the grass that had known drought and flood and the full weight of seasons, over the ridge where they had sat and looked at the country and said what was true, over the creek running silver in the dark, over all of it, enormous and still and enduring, the West that Charlotte Dugan had come for and Aaron Weston had given her, and they had made of it together something that would last.